Some years ago, Linda and I were on a cruise and we heard a talk about the painting Guernica. We found it absolutely fascinating. The detail in it and the horror of the bombing of that Basque town. So I'd resolved that we would have a talk on it at this festival. And the only challenge was to find the right speaker. I'm very pleased to say that Gijs van Hensbergen is such a man. He's got a passionate interest in Spain, and he's specialized in Picasso and Gaudi, and he's got a very interesting talk prepared for us on Guernica. Gijs, welcome to Haslemere, and over to you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Hamish. I've left Guernica on the screen for us to, as it were, familiarize ourselves with it. In a sense, we don't need to, of course, because all of us know the painting almost inside out because we've seen it so many times reproduced. But it is one of those luxuries, actually, of lockdown, is to do that thing of close looking and having time to look at things. But the talk I'm going to give you today there's quite a lot of new material. I spent 10 years researching for my book on Guernica, the icon of the 20th century. But since the book came out and since it's finished, there's a lot more stuff that has arrived. And some of what you're getting is, as it were, kind of fresh and new, and some of it quite controversial. So stay with me, and I will hopefully give you some surprises. Let's just have a quick description of what we're actually looking at. On the right-hand side, we've got three women, one who's got her arm coming in holding a lantern, another with her arms up in shock. The lady down on the right-hand side is leaning, looking up at the lantern or the big flashlight with the light bulb in it. Further into the center, we've got a horse in the center with a lance straight through it. And then we've got a decapitated figure, bottom left, the arm chopped off, as you can see, the head almost like a classical bust, the hand on the left-hand side with all those marks on the palm. In fact, there's an entire PhD just on what those marks on the hand could possibly mean. Above it, there's a very tragic figure of a woman holding a baby, and then a bull looking in at us. And just in the shadows to the right of the bull, between the bull's head and the head of the horse, we have some kind of bird. Is it someone suggested a seagull? Is it the cockerel that crows 3 times? Because I think what we're looking at is an image that, because Picasso painted it, and Picasso, in my opinion, is the greatest genius in art ever. That's a bit of a claim to make, but I'll make it, and I believe it. And what we've got is a kind of condensation of the history of art in one image. Well, let's go on, and I'm having a problem here just clicking. No, I'm good here. So I want to show you this. It's a strange picture maybe to show you, is what one might immediately think of as a rather rubbishy slide of when the painting was in New York from 1939 to 1981, in exile, as it were, because of the Spanish Civil War, and then Franco as the caudillo, as the leader of Spain. Picasso wanted the painting not to go to Spain, and it stayed in America. Well, it's a strange slide because it looks very kind of keyed up, very bright. And the first thing is this was sent to me actually only about a week ago by the man who went over for Spain, the chief curator, José María Cabrero, who collected the painting to bring it to Spain back in 1981. And this slide is actually taken prior to fluorescent lighting. Gosh, well, we haven't seen paintings in our lifetime really without some form of fluorescent lighting. And what we see here is the painting in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it's very bright, it's very intense. Also, of course, because it is a slide, but what I want to do is show you a little bit under the skin, because what was extraordinary, I was talking to José María, and I said, there's a strange thing, I've seen this picture thousands of times, and I said, on some days, although it's the most famous grisaille painting, grisaille being anything between white and black and all the shades in between. And I say, I know that it's a grisaille painting, but some days I see color in it. I see a brown or I see a slight purple. And he says, Gijs, you're right and you're wrong. You're wrong in the sense that there is no other color, but you're right that you're seeing the other color. And I said, well, how does that work? He says, well, when I got it back to Spain, I took microscopic photos, and Picasso had actually prepared that canvas in a way that Roger van der Weyden had done 500 years earlier, 600 years earlier, those great paintings of the Netherlandish school. And what he did was an extraordinary trick. He primed the canvas with one layer of white, and on top of that, some kind of charcoaly substance you can see on the top half of the slide. And then in the next layer of white, broken glass is ground down very, very finely into the white, so that what you actually get is the painting working almost as a mirror, bouncing in light, absorbing it and bouncing it out. And we know that from the broken glass that these different colors arrive. So not everything is as it seems. And the magician, of course, the man who painted it, Pablo Picasso, here on the beach in 1934, holding the skull of a bull, desiccated with his, I think just for a joke, of course, having his fingernails painted. Here, the man, well, he was great on myths. The idea that he was the only man who could look the sun straight in the eye, and it would be the sun that blinked rather than Pablo Picasso. The great creator, the man who in fact created for 91 years of his life 3 finished works of art for every single day of his life. I mean, astonishing. We're up to 37,500 original works that Picasso produced. So he's a kind of protean extraordinary force. And here he's putting on one of his alter egos. When he was young in Barcelona, he was the Harlequin, that sad figure of the Blue Period. And in the 1930s, as we're leading up to the Spanish Civil War, and there is a huge amount of ferment in Spain, and of course, the Spanish Civil War now, I mean, I think Paul Preston, who is the great authority on this, would say that we've got to look at the long Second World War, that in fact, the Spanish Civil War was just a lead up and part of that whole World War phenomena. And he chooses the Minotaur to associate with. The Minotaur, this protean kind of powerful beast. And these, of course, are cruel times. So this is not a talk that in any way can end, shall we say, with a great deal of happiness, but certainly, hopefully, some enlightenment. Well, it was a very difficult time in Picasso's life. On the left-hand side, he's standing there with Olga Koklova, his first wife. Olga is very much a society woman. She's Russian. She wanted Picasso to be part of the, you know, the kind of the gratin of Paris, the haute monde, society figure, the great genius, of course, and everybody recognized him as that. And here he is, of course, in one of his Savile Row suits, playing up to what Olga wanted of him. But what she didn't realize, of course, is in 1934, a few years earlier, in fact, in 1927, he was standing outside the Galerie Lafayette in the 9th in Paris, and he bumps into this girl, 17-year-old Marie-Thérèse Walter, on the right-hand side of the screen. And Marie-Thérèse, he looks at her, she's there looking in the window, trying to choose a Peter Pan collar. And he looks at her and says, "You and I together, we're going to do great things." And she kind of looks at him and says, "Who are you?" I mean, he's in his 50s, she's 17. And 7 weeks later, they're an item. It was part of that whole surrealist movement as well, the idea of the mad love, the amour fou. Well, Picasso describes this period of 34 as possibly the saddest of his life, because Marie-Thérèse, he's now been with for 7 years. Olga, he's married to. He's going to make his life a little bit more complicated later on with yet another attachment. But he is at the moment where his country is imploding. He's in Paris and feels, in a sense, kind of slightly impotent. But let's see what happens. Well, in 1934, in the summer, and it's the last recorded time we ever see or hear of Picasso in Spain, 1934, the August the 29th, and he goes to see this building. It was the first great modernist building in Spain, the Yacht Club in San Sebastian, by a very young architect called Aispurua. And he goes there to meet because he's come to San Sebastian because he wants to go and see the bulls and go to Spain, but it's en route in, but also because he's invited to this extraordinary thing which could only happen in Spain and only in San Sebastian, is a fascist food society. And he gets invited to GU. And GU is set up by Aispurua, the architect on the right-hand side, and this rather sinister, kind of extraordinary figure on the left-hand side, sitting in his Le Corbusier chair, Jiménez Caballero, who later on would become the speechwriter for Francisco Franco, the Caudillo. And they tempt Picasso over there because it's the last time that you can be the left wing, the right wing, and all in betweens in the same room, talking about food, but joking with each other and talking about the avant-garde. And Jiménez Caballero, of course, reports later on that he'd won Picasso from the right, for the right. Well, that was nonsense, but we know from the way that he twisted the truth, his alternative truth, that Jiménez Caballero felt that Picasso was on side. Well, we'll see later on, of course, that that was a very erroneous picture of what had happened. Picasso goes back to Paris. He's sad to leave Spain, but Spain has already gone from that silver period, the wonderful Renaissance under people like Garcia Lorca, the poet, and this whole move of optimism of taking schools out into the countryside and raising up the level of education. And he comes back to Paris, and he's in a kind of, in a very, very puzzled, very sad moment. In fact, he writes to his friend Sabartez and says, "Please come, I'm living through the worst time of my life." And if we always think of Picasso as the Minotaur, then that's surely Picasso coming in on the right-hand side of this print, Minotauromachy. Again, it's one of those enigmatic prints which have been analyzed by hundreds of art historians and psychoanalysts and other writers, and they're not quite sure what we're looking at and what it means. We've got a girl who is holding up a bunch of flowers and a candle, and the Minotaur is putting his hand in front of the flame, either because the light is blinding him or distracting him. We have below a woman who is a bullfighter who's actually thrown across the bull. You can see her face is down to the right, then her two bare breasts and her swollen tummy. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I was in Paris in the apartment with Marie-Thérèse and Picasso's daughter, Maya. And she said, "Can you imagine a father who the first time he paints your mother, she's there pregnant with you in the belly, and you're thrown across a horse." This kind of time of autobiography creeping in, but also the beginnings of that tension and that violence that, of course, would explode in Spain in 36 and carry on, of course, into the end in Japan with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Picasso reaches a stalemate. This is, yes, it's a painting by Picasso. It's the last painting he thought he might ever paint in 1935. I mean, I suppose allowed to say it because I'm a Picasso scholar, but I think it's appalling. It's so bad that I suspect it was on purpose that he painted it like this. It's very maudlin, it's very sentimental. Perhaps it's Picasso saying to himself as he paints, just imagine how bad a painter I could have been if I'd have just stayed in Barcelona and carried on producing mawkish pictures of the ideal family. And his family was very far from ideal in that he'd already got the daughter, Maya, born from the Marie-Thérèse association, but also, of course, from his lover, but also, of course, still married to Olga, devout Catholic, and it was very difficult for him to get a divorce. And he says he's going to stop painting, and in fact, that what he wants to do is become a poet. And quite seriously, he says to his secretary, Sabartez, what I want to be remembered for in the end is that on my tombstone it will say, Picasso, poet, one-time artist. Well, Picasso couldn't keep himself away from painting or sketching. He does reduce his output to only 25 kind of doodles for that year. But this year is going to end very badly, of course. In 34, Francisco Franco, who you see on the right-hand side, the youngest general in Europe, a cold-blooded, ice running through his veins, is called into Asturias to put down the miners' strike, and he does it in a very brutal fashion. He's sent away into exile by the then left-wing government to the Canary Islands, and it's from there on the 16th of July 1936 that he's brought back, picked up by two what are presumably, now we think, MI5 agents who leave from Croydon Airport, pick up codename Miss Spain, and bring him over to start the Spanish Civil War. Well, the Civil War starts in the south, but very quickly moves towards the capital, Madrid. And yes, these are horrific images, and they went across the world, as we can see, because of the logo on the right-hand side, or the description in English. That's not a translation. That was also how the posters came out. And this was the bombing that was taking place of the Madrid, the legitimate capital of Spain, where the legitimate voted-in government was still in power. But the nationalists under Franco had swept in and had started what would become our first examples of total warfare. These images aren't lost on Picasso. I mean, he was somebody who had the capacity, as Sabates said, to remember everything and forget everything if he wanted to. Well, he remembered every single image that he saw in his life. I think it was an extraordinary capacity for this visual memory. And images like this kind of burnt into him. Well, at around about this time, there he is again as the Minotaur, moving house. He's back in Paris. He's just started to paint again. And it's a very sad picture. It's again, I don't think one of his greatest paintings, but it's an image where the Minotaur is moving house. There's a horse falling out of the back. The whole cart is full. And it's perhaps him imagining, in a sense, what would happen if he did divorce Olga. She calls in the huissier, the bailiffs, who put seals on his studios, and he realizes that he's going to lose his whole kind of memory bank of images in the divorce case. And the divorce is called off, and cooled off as well a little bit. And so we have Picasso here in this state, and just about this time, he's made the director of the Prado Museum, the most famous artist in the world. The government says, well, look, we need you just as a kind of figurehead to demand international attention. And so what we get here is Picasso as the director of the Prado, of an empty museum, as he called it, because the museum would have to be emptied. Because as we see here, these are the bombs landing as they do on the Prado building. It took 8 direct hits. Luckily, nothing was damaged. And from Paris, with friends who were there on site, Christian Zervos, who would then become the person who did his catalogue raisonné, was working there, and friends like Rafael Alberti, the poet, who were taking away and packing up the Prado. This is one of the great Goya paintings on a lorry, ready to go off down to Valencia, down a corridor, past the nationalist troops, and to safety, where they were put in one of the old military gates of Valencia and shored up under concrete and protected. In fact, the great Meninas was taken and by Alberti, and on the first roundabout, the bombs started falling again. He ran out, tried to get the painting into a doorway which was too small, left it in the street, and came out when the bombing had finished. I mean, probably the greatest painting in the history of art was almost lost on day one of the Exodus. Picasso very keen on this and following it very closely, particularly this man, Josep Renau, who comes to him in Paris. He's the director of fine arts for Spain. And he says, Picasso, we need you to paint an image for the Great Fair in 1936. So he persuades him. He also wants to go and get Salvador Dali. But just as he's on the phone, Dali storms in and says, don't have that horrible, nasty communist Picasso in the show. You must have me. And there was good reason why he might. I mean, the painting Autumn Cannibalism on the left-hand side, bought then by Edward James later on, is an extraordinary picture of a country eating itself up in the civil war, the fratricidal war. Well, Picasso on the 8th of January 1937 responds, and he responds with this first extraordinary series, The Dream and Lie of Franco. He hasn't yet thought of what the great picture is going to be in the pavilion in 37, but here he is, and we've got this extraordinary kind of figure, a turd-like figure that sits on the back of a horse, and then you've got to read it back to front. It's not Picasso or me that's put the slide wrong. It was just Picasso did this in the heat of the moment and created this print, all 9 little etchings in half a day on the January 37. So he forgot, of course, that if you flip a print over, the name is printed wrong. So we've got to read it like Japanese prints, the wrong way around, as it were, from right to left, not the wrong way around, but the way that is done in the East. So we see this figure on a crown on the top horse with the sunlight. Then it turns into a penis and is sitting on top and crosses the Straits of Gibraltar, just like Franco did. Then it starts smashing up as we see classical sculpture. And then it goes through all of these scatological, kind of almost burlesque scenes of violence, of fake religiosity. Underneath the classical bust, there's a figure praying to the host, which is not the host, it's a duro, a 5 peseta piece, already getting an idea of Franco's greed and lust for money. Well, on the 19th of April, and the exhibition is about to start, Picasso still has absolutely no idea what he's going to do for the exhibition. And this sketch, I think, shows you that he's already trying out, because he knows the space of the pavilion, he knows where the picture is going to be, and then you see in the middle, there's one in perspective and there's one straight on, how big that painting would be in the space. And he's got no idea what he's going to do. On the right-hand side, we have an attempt at what he always does, which is artist and model, almost like a leitmotif to get the creative juices running. But let's go on from there and see what happens then on the 26th of April, just a week later. Planes leave Vitoria airport at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's market day in Guernica, and the bombing starts. The Condor Legion from the Luftwaffe and an Italian group of planes, they load up their incendiary bombs and fly over this Basque city, where the oak tree stands, where the King of Spain still has to swear his allegiance to the Basque Country and his obligation to protect it. And it's the first case of saturation bombing. We can see what's left afterwards. It's 98% of the building stock was reduced to rubble. We now know that it's probably far more than 1,000 dead. And it's extraordinary. And this is something that only came out last year. A friend of mine, Xavier Orujo, who discovered that the bombing of Guernica, and this is the sickness of the dictator and his that mentality. This is Goering in Carlin Hall, his estate, where he kept his pet lions. Well, what he liked to do was give special presents, and Guernica was a birthday present for Hitler, so that he would see what saturation bombing actually really looked like. Hitler would give him paintings. In fact, he ended up with 1,400 paintings and kept some of them. At the end of the war, in fact, the Van Eyck altarpiece from Ghent ended up in a salt mine, hidden away, and fortunately was saved, as were so many of the other works. But he organized it, and this is the showing of Wotan in the Met in New York, in a sense kind of inspired by, perhaps by these ideas, but the actual bombing of Guernica was organized like a Wagnerian opera. The Ring of Fire. First of all, the planes came over, they went to all the water sources, bombed those out. Then they went and made sure that everybody got down into the bunkers, the war bunkers, the bomb shelters. And then they bombed the bomb shelters. And then they set everything on fire. And the world was utterly shocked. It had happened before in 1917 by the English in Baghdad, in Tunisia, by the French, in Algiers by the Americans and the English and the French. But it had never been done in Europe, and never been done in such an extraordinary way. And shockwaves went across the world. It was the crossing of the Rubicon, total war. This is now what total war looks like. And I will move on from that image and now work our way towards an explanation of Guernica itself. Picasso gets the news on the 27th of April. He still doesn't know what he's going to do. He's in a state of shock. He's getting all the gossip from people like Renal and the poet Bergamin, friends in Paris. It's in all the newspapers. There's real footage now coming out. There's the black and white photographs. One of the reasons perhaps people think that the painting was in grisaille. And we get Picasso on the 1st of May. It's May Day. It's the big working celebration, the Workers' Day. And Paris is almost brought to a standstill with 2 million people out on the streets. Picasso wends his way through Paris, fights his way through the crowds and goes to his studio and starts what will become the final image. This is an early sketch. It's the first sketch. It took him all of, my guess is, half a minute, maybe a minute to do this, a quick doodle. But it's got a lot of the things that we'll see in the end painting. That figure coming out of the window on the right-hand side. There's a horse. There's a bird just sitting over the horse. There's a figure in the middle, which is perhaps, we don't know what it is. Is it a bull? Is it a horse? Is there something slumped there? And there's kind of arc light on the right-hand side going around, almost as if it's looking into a theatre and kind of a spotlight that is showing on this thing here. We go by the end of the day, it's already, he's working up, and he's actually working now onto a canvas, sketching in ideas. We've got a horse now with a wound in the side and a kind of Pegasus fleeing and flying out of the horse's wound. We've got a bull, a very benign looking bull. On the left-hand side, we've got lances, we've got a kind of mixed up again with the hoof and the leg of the horse. And then this kind of cartoonish figure on the right-hand side of the woman coming in, almost as the witness or the person who's showing us the tragedy of this scene. Well, we're very, very lucky because a lot of the process, and we've got to think that from beginning to end, he painted this extraordinary picture, 7 meters by 3 meters tall, in 7 weeks from start to finish. 9 different versions of the painting on the same canvas, i.e. one on top of the other, and we're seeing version number 2 here. And it was all recorded by someone who would make his life even more complicated, Dora Maar, the photographer, who had become his lover, Marie-Thérèse out in the country, Olga with Paolo, the son, also in Paris, Marie-Thérèse and Maya out in the country, and Dora Maar in and out of the studio. She was a great photographer, and she was recording the creation of the image. And here we have Picasso in the grenier, the grain store in the Rue des Grands Augustins, where he had the studio, and him working out different ways of painting. Here's one of him close up, getting ready to go up on a ladder, because it was, after all, 3 meters tall, and he needed to paint the top parts, actually with a mahl stick, standing up at an angle, because the painting was so large it couldn't actually stand upright properly, and was back at a kind of lean in the studio. his Dora, beautiful woman, the extraordinary figure, and some would say the one woman who actually, in a sense, stood up to him intellectually, and was also hugely creative and inspirational for the whole group of surrealists. And she was there and, in a sense, nursed the creation as well, along with Picasso. Well, she is the one who then, of course, becomes the Weeping Woman. This is one of the prints that would inform the great painting that's in the Tate that was owned by Penrose, who bought it directly from Picasso. And he said that's her real truth, the depth of her. And it comes in and we get this process on a very, very funny day. The story, one day down in the street below the studio, Henry Moore is with Penrose, and there's on the left-hand side, his friend José Bergamin, a poet. And Picasso comes down and says, come up, just see what I'm doing. And because Henry Moore wasn't good at French, and Picasso was certainly not very good at Henry Moore's Yorkshire accent and English, or Roland Penrose, they couldn't commute. Penrose was good at the French. But to kind of mime the thing, the image on the right-hand side, the woman that comes into Guernica, Picasso runs to the toilet, gets some paper, toilet paper, and puts it in the hand of the woman on the right-hand side and says to Henry Moore, you know, this is mimes. This is what a like is, a bombing, is you don't even have time to go and wipe your bottom. And he then turns to Bergamin and he draws an eye and he gives it to Bergamin and puts it into a little box and says, every Friday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I want you to put that eye on the painting, whichever figure you think it needs. 4 o'clock, Friday, Christ. We have the idea of sacrifice. And that's what I think comes in. And on that day, Picasso says, you know what I'm going to do? I don't want black and white, I'm going to go color. And all of them kind of look in horror because they see how powerful and effective the image is. And Bergamin says, Pablo, you are the man who invented Cubism. You are the man, why don't you get your papier collé, your collage, your little bits of wallpaper, cut them out, stick them on the painting, and then we can see if it works. And that's exactly what you're seeing here in the image. It only lasted for about half an hour, but Guernica could have looked like this if they'd have stopped it there and then. The wallpaper was then peeled off again, and the painting evolves into what we have here as the kind of final image. Well, I'd like to come back to describing, in a sense, what we're seeing, because I'm convinced that actually that whole idea, which he hinted at with Bergamin, of the religious painting, is much closer to the truth. We've got something which is unusual in Spain, and unusual even to see today, is that during Holy Week in Spain, you remember, I'm sure if you've traveled through Spain or seen lots of photos on film, that we see these immensely kind of gaudy cathedrals with lots of gold everywhere and these massive, great kind of faith machines, these high altars with kind of Solomonic columns and just overpowering the scale of these things. I mean, the one in Seville, actually, the high altar alone holds a 5-story apartment for the priests to change their clothing, offices or whatever, in the back of the high altar. And for Holy Week, what they do in front of this gold image, normally of the Virgin or Christ and the crucifixion, or the different saints who are the patron saints of that city, they cover it in a grey and white sheet, which is very somber, and covers the entire thing with an image of the crucifixion or something that is incredibly sad and completely reenacts the whole sacred theatre of what is Holy Week in Spain. And I think it's that tonality, that feeling, that mentalité, as the French historians would call it, of Holy Week, the obsession with death that is in Spain. But of course, the one thing here is that we have ritual, but ritual that has gone wrong. It's not just Holy Week that we're looking at. We're looking at, of course, at the bullfight. We see the bull on the left-hand side. In fact, there's a lovely story that on the left-hand side, you can see where the bull's tail is, that one day he had gone out shopping and comes back and it had been leaking in the studio and water had come running down on that left-hand side. So the whole thing of the surrealist, as it were, the object trouvé, or the fortunate accident, he turns that into the tail, turns the bull around. And if you look under the head of the bull, you can see that there is some pentimenti, there's some underdrawing that is bleeding through and has done since 1937 to the present day, and slowly becoming more apparent. There are lots of things here which I do see changing, even over the 10, 15 years that I've been obsessing over this image. But let's look in the center. It's a kind of triangular structure. It's the kind of classic Baroque way of organizing a canvas with lots of gesture, drama, and then this Renaissance feel like you might get in a Raphael painting of the triangles leading us up to the central light. And then these figures breaking in. The figures on the right-hand side, it's very easy because there's three of them. The three women can either be the three women in his life, Marie-Thérèse, Olga and Dora Maar, or we could talk about the three graces, or any other kind of association with the trinity of women. But here, let's just think of them as witnesses coming in onto a scene, holding the light up, showing the carnage that has taken place. In earlier versions of the painting, we saw that the figure that's decapitated on the left was actually a self-portrait of Picasso with the head looking the other way around. He then turns himself and transforms himself into a classical bust, but a broken bust. So we've got complete carnage, we've got destruction, we've got something that never happens in the bullfight, which is where the horse itself is lanced through the stomach. It's very cruel, it's very savage. It's extraordinary to stand in front of it and see, as I do most times if I go there early in the morning, that the school trips, because it's almost like going to Lourdes or going to Santiago de Compostela, for every Spanish school child, you have to go to visit Guernica once in your life. And the children, 5, 6 years old, come in, they're all on the string holding the line with their teacher at the front, and the teacher doesn't have to say anything. They just all go very, very quiet. And they're standing in front of this looking, and some of them upset, some of them kind of, they've already been prepared at school by what they're going to see, but it's amazing how powerful. And then when you look around the fellow viewers of this painting from all over the world, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, from Latin America, whatever, it speaks to everyone. And it's not perhaps strange that it's on exhibit now in the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, that the director of the museum gets requests every year from every city that's ever been bombed to be allowed to house this painting. Of course, the painting is very fragile. It's 7 meters by 3 meters. It's been restored at least once back in the 1960s, where they ironed encaustic wax into the back of the painting to hold the flaking paint and the stretcher. But of course, what happens is that made the stretcher heavier. It's under much more tension. And actually, if you just touch the painting, it would be like throwing a pebble into a pond. The shock waves would go across and it would create some damage to the image. But let's finish on something which is more hopeful. Let's go down to the bottom of the painting, right in the center, and you see the broken off arm holding that broken sword. And just above it, we see a little plant that's growing. I mean, this is the tabula rasa. This is what happens, the nihilistic bombing of a city. From the ashes, finally will grow a new Guernica, the city, but will also grow a new mentality and an understanding of the brutality of war. And the fact that Picasso, in only 7 weeks, creates an image that is so iconic that it's stolen by every warring party, left or right, and in between in the world, as a kind of emblem that they use and is used by the United Nations as their introductory pack for third world educational projects. It's extraordinary that Picasso in 7 weeks could find something and create something that was so amazingly powerful. Thank you. I'll happily take any questions. I'm afraid I can't hear you.
Sorry, I've unmuted now, so I think that's all right. Yes. There are no questions yet, so let me just ask one to start the ball rolling. Did I understand you to say that there's a copy of this painting in Guernica?
There is now a kind of facsimile near to where the oak tree was. There is the Museum of Peace in Guernica. There was a copy until quite recently, but now the heirs of Nelson Rockefeller are about to sell it off. But outside the Security Council in the United Nations in New York, there was a tapestry copy of the painting, not quite the same size. But this painting, the original, is in Spain. It took from 1937, it had never been in Spain, from 37 until 1981, when it finally made it across the Atlantic and arrived in Madrid to an outhouse of the Prado Museum, where it was first shown.
Thank you. I'm still waiting for any questions to come in. Yes, there is one. Question says, I understood that Picasso took inspiration from Rubens, Consequences of War. Is this true?
Picasso took inspiration from so many things. Let me just very quickly, I'll just do you a very quick idea, because you've got to remember what I said, he has an extraordinary memory. He would always, and perhaps this is a kind of deflection, he would always talk down Rubens. But look at this, we've got a wonderful crater. Look at this, we've got wonderful classical busts. We've got medieval illuminated manuscripts from the 11th century. We've got in Sardinia, we've got the war horse coming across. We've got Michael Wolgemut's Dances of Death. We've got Theodore Rousseau, who's one of his favorite artists. Horse coming. You can go on and on and on. Guido Reni, Caravaggio, that figure that's on the right-hand side, very much reflected. And then let's come to Rubens, because you mentioned Rubens. And I had this one moment, every art historian wants to do this, great art historians thing of finding the absolute painting that must have inspired Guernica. And I found it. And I thought I was brilliant. So I phoned up the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, who also thinks that I've come up with something very, very interesting, and says, that's absolutely fascinating, guys. Unfortunately, this painting was in the Duke of Beaufort's collection until 1951, and Picasso couldn't possibly have seen it. So that doesn't, in a sense, ruin my thesis, but what it does show is that gesture and the structures of canvases and the way that things are repeated over the ages are actually, there is a language of art and gesture that somebody like Picasso just absorbs so cleverly into his work. So Rubens, I think, is a great area for working up onto and a new way of looking at Picasso as well, because Rubens, of course, did these great, the Medici cycle, which are in the Prado. And one's got to remember that Picasso was the director of the Prado in absentia. And he knew the Prado inside out. We know from the records, this wonderful kind of very boring art history, but very useful, of record books of copyists. Whenever you go into the Prado, you have to write down what you're copying. So we know that Picasso actually went into the Prado rather more often than he would let on later on in life, and we know exactly what he was looking at. So yes, I'm sure that Rubens is there, although Picasso kind of denigrated him and says, yeah, the trouble with Rubens is you get exactly the same paint all over the canvas. He doesn't kind of distinguish. It's just too much froth. It's too much over the top, kind of wonderful, voluptuous paint. Well, Rubens was a colorist, and Picasso was not so much a colorist. He left that mantle to Henri Matisse.
I thought your description at the beginning of the powdered glass was so interesting, which means that it can reflect different colors.
Exactly. And that's exactly what happens. Some days you see a brown and some days you see a purple. And Jose Maria he's a very spiritual man. He's the most distinguished curator in Spain, the conservator rather. And I was talking to him only a couple of days ago, and I think, in a sense, Jose, we could see the actual priming of the canvas as the soul of the canvas. And I could see he got very excited by that idea, that you've got something to work with which is already alive, something where you put things on top of that surface and it just heightens the effect. They almost kind of breathe, respire. And I think that's why, if you've ever been lucky enough to see the deposition by Roger van der Weyden in the Prado, why that has such incredible hypnotic power, because you feel this kind of power and energy emanating from the canvas. Well, I think perhaps this is a very good example to say perhaps that's what Rubens was also very good at, but also Picasso in terms of the doing the royal, the Guernica.
So do we know when that first was used, that technique?
Well, we're going back to the 14th century, and possibly earlier than that. Of course, what the difference is that with oil paint and everything, you can start getting glazes coming through, and that has another effect altogether.
Guys, I've got one more comment, which I think is very fitting online. It says, "Thank you. That was a wonderful account. It's such a powerful painting." And it is. I'd like to thank you on behalf of all of us for such an inspiring talk, showing us the background of the situation at the time, showing us how Picasso evolved, and showing how the painting evolved to be such a great artistic contribution. Thank you so much for your contribution to us.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. Thank you.
Pleasure.